everyone, and welcome back to another episode. My name is Dana, and I will be your host. And today, our guest is Heather Engel, who is back again. We did a video before, and now she's back. How are you, Heather?
Hey, Dana, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me again.
Well, glad to have you back. Why don't you take a quick second and just let everybody know a little bit about you, a little bit about what you do, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Heather Engel, founder and managing partner at Strategic Cyber Partners, and we focus primarily on advisory services, working not only with companies that are in the DoD space, providing services in the DIB, but also just general commercial clients. We do a lot of audit and advisory work, and we also do a lot of incident response planning.
Which is fabulous. And I'm so excited to talk about this today because I think that the planning and the exercises is something that we really have to do a little bit more of, because there's a lot of talking sometimes, even if there is any talking, but the exercises I think is really going to be helpful. So I'm so happy that we're going to get to talk about this. Okay, so incident response and exercise planning is our topic. And our first question is going to be, what are the DFARS and CMMC requirements for incident response?
Right. So most of our listeners are probably familiar with this. We have twofold requirements. We have the requirements that are under the DFARS Clause 252.204-7012, and we have requirements in NIST 800-171, which also translates to being your CMMC requirement. So under the DFARS requirement, when an incident is discovered that affects a covered contractor information system or that affects your ability to perform on an operationally critical contract, you have to, one, review to determine if CUI was compromised, and if so, rapidly report. So rapidly report is defined as within 72 hours. And then we have minimum elements for reporting. Some of those can be documented ahead of time, and we definitely recommend that companies do this. The rest of them are going to be incident specific. And those are the things that you're going to need when you're making your report to the DIBnet. You also have to preserve and protect images. This means that you have to have a plan for doing forensics or for creating images of your systems in the event of a breach or a compromise. You have to be able to look at the forensic capabilities within your organization. And if there are none, start planning for a third party that's going to assist you, or start planning to train some of your internal employees on how to do this. And then the other thing that we have to do under 7012 is if the DoD requests access to your systems to perform their own forensic investigation, or if they want to see copies of the images, you have to provide that access when they request it. So remember, we said our requirements are twofold. You have the DFARS requirement, and then you have the NIST requirements. The NIST requirements fall under Incident Response Section 3.6, and there are three of them. The first is for you to establish a capability that includes preparation, detection, analysis, containment, recovery, and user responses. That's a mouthful, but we generally do that in an incident response plan. When it says establish a capability, this means that we have to think through and document the process for all of these phases of incident response. And as an auditor, I want to see an incident response plan that addresses all of these, but I also want to see procedures with specific action items for each of those things. How are you going to contain your incident? What are some of the actions that you would take? The second NIST control, 3.6.2, requires you to track and document your incidents. How are you going to do this? You also have to understand and identify what your internal and your external reporting requirements are. And this should be granular. You don't want to be wondering during an incident how to get a hold of your contracting officer or when you should tell the CEO that you're dealing with a data breach. You also want to identify primary and backup contacts for each of these reporting requirements. And remember, some of your incidents might require the involvement of the FBI, or it might require you to notify users if you've lost their data. So one of the things to think about with incident response planning is that this shouldn't just be to cover controlled unclassified information. That may be the reason that we're putting this together, but we also want to look at what other types of data we have and what the impact on our organization is if we had a breach that maybe didn't involve CUI, but it was personally identifiable information. And then the third requirement under NIST is to test the incident response capability. And that's what we're going to talk in a lot more detail about today.
All right. Well, that was really, really helpful. I just have a quick question, because I think that, what is it? An ounce of cure is worth a pound of measure. Is that what it is? An ounce of whatever it
Yeah,
is. Anyway,
prevention is or cure is worth a pound of
yes.
something like
Yeah,
that.
something like that. But so a lot of proactive stuff is not being done at all. So as you
Yeah.
mentioned that there's some stuff that we could do ahead of time, and I think even just a list of phone numbers is something is better than nothing. But can you just talk about just a little bit of what somebody could be doing right now before something happens?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about this throughout the course of this discussion today, but absolutely understanding what the capabilities are within your organization. So looking at the skill set that you have. Some of my clients don't have an internal IT department at all. They outsource everything to a managed service provider. And so in that case, you're going to want to have that conversation with the managed service provider to make sure that they have the capability to do this, because not all of them do. Um, if you do have internal IT, maybe understanding if someone there knows how to use a forensic tool. Does anybody have experience with doing incident response?
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, even just the basics of, what's the number for your cyber liability policy? If I want to make a claim under a cyber insurance policy, how do I do that? What are some of the communications personnel within my organization that might need to be involved? Because one of the other things that we teach in incident response planning and exercises is that communication is so key, and how you communicate both internally and externally about an incident can really make or break you. And we can all think of examples of companies that we've seen handle data breaches really, really poorly, even just in the last 6 months to a year. And so spending some time ahead of time, even just thinking through your communication strategy, is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, and without any guidelines, just internally, the employees will do what they think they should do, right? And they may not
Yeah.
realize what damage certain things are going to do, like posting things online on social media. So that's very important to address some of this stuff ahead of time. Okay, our next question.
Yeah.
So how does somebody know that they are dealing with a reportable incident?
Yeah. And this is one that has really kind of evolved over time as we've gotten to know the DFARS clause a little bit better, as more companies have been making reports under that clause. Initially you can really struggle with, we could report almost anything. So one of the ways that we recommend our clients delineate this is we define an event versus an incident. And so we document in our incident response plan how we separate those things out. An event is generally something that's unusual, and it might be an indicator of compromise, but we just don't know yet. This may be something that your SIM tool flagged as unusual behavior. We have to investigate it. We have to determine why it was flagged and understand the cause. And it might turn out to be nothing. It might require a more detailed investigation, or it might be that we've actually had an incident, in which case we would elevate from an event to an incident. The official definition of an incident is something that violates the confidentiality, the integrity, meaning the correctness of your data, or the availability of an information system. So this could be anything from a user violating a security policy. It could be a lost computer. It might be confirmation of an unauthorized user in your system, or a confirmed data exfiltration. But those all fall under the official definition of an incident. In your incident response plan, you really need to have a decision tree for reporting when it comes to the DoD, not only to make the decision easier in the moment, but to defend your response actions if your handling is ever called into question. And we see this happen a lot. I've had a number of clients who have made reports to the DIB, and almost universally, the DoD is going to come back and they're going to have additional questions. And you need to be able to answer those questions as far as how the incident was identified. What decisions did you make to investigate? What type of investigation did you do? And so then understanding through the creation of that decision tree helps you really be consistent in saying, yes, this is something that we would report, or no, this is something that we would not report. The DFARS clause defines a cyber incident as actions taken through the use of computer networks that result in a compromise, and this part is important, or an actual or potentially adverse effect on an information system and the information residing therein. So now we're talking about potentially adverse effects, and that presents a very broad definition of what is reportable. So this is where your decision tree comes in. So For example, let's say you have a user who responded to an MFA prompt bombing attack and their email account is compromised. Does that user have access to CUI? Well, if the answer is yes, then that's a potentially adverse effect on government information. And so that to me would appear to be a reportable event under the DFARS clause definition. Through the investigation, we could prove or disprove that CUI was actually compromised, but under the strict definition that's outlined in the DFARS clause, we would make a report there.
Are you having a hard time finding new customers? A lot of folks just like you in the IT and cybersecurity space are in the same situation. And they have embraced a new opportunity to get new clients. They're doing this by growing their online presence and maximizing the power of LinkedIn. How, you ask? I have a tried and tested method called my Cyber Social Program. I myself have been on LinkedIn and now have over 3.5 million LinkedIn views, and over on YouTube, I have over 750,000 video views. So I can show you exactly how I have done that so that you can promote your organization and become the authority in your industry. And the best part is, I've done all of this organically without one paid ad. You don't need to waste your money over on Google with pay-per-click ads. Now's the time to establish yourself. Look around. The competition isn't doing it. This is your time to shine online before they do. So if you're ready to start your online journey and future-proof your business, please, down below, click the link and schedule a time for us to have a 45-minute call where I can review the exact methodology of the Cyber Social Program. You can also click below to see some of my masterclasses, which will give you quick little snippets of a couple of things you can do right away on LinkedIn that will help with your profile. I hope to see you and hear from you soon.
I can only imagine that thought process, because when you put that potential word in there,
Yeah.
That really opens things up to, we probably should report this kind of mentality. But I like that decision tree thing. That's really, really good. And, when people are going through this, there's a nervousness because something's just happened. So you're maybe not thinking 100% clearly. So to have all those different steps that, okay, if this is it, then we're going to go this way. And if it's this is what's happening, we're going to go this way. That's very, very helpful. So I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Yeah, it really is. And these are the kind of things and the kind of decisions that you don't want to make for the first time under pressure, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we talked about in the first, part of this conversation, that preparation phase is key. And really thinking through these things as you develop your incident response plan will go a long way towards making you and your employees and your colleagues more comfortable when you're actually dealing with an incident.
Mm-hmm. It's like anything that we do often, we're better than, the first time it's happening. You're like, whoa, what's this? So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. So how does an organization test the incident response capability? Here's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, this is interesting because this is one of the clauses that's frequently highlighted as being one of the controls that is very often not implemented. So a lot of organizations are doing the incident response plan, they're ready to report, but then they're just not doing that last step of testing the capability. There's lots of ways we can do this. When we scope exercises for our clients, we look at a few things. So we want to look again at the internal capability of the IT staff. How large is the organization? Have they done any kind of crisis management exercise before? And it doesn't have to be related to IT, right? It can be a business continuity planning exercise. It can be an active shooter drill. Do they have any experience doing any kind of exercise? Most companies are going to start with what's called a tabletop exercise. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a discussion-based exercise where you have key people sitting around the table and we're discussing our response to a specific situation. We're not going to bring any systems down. We're not trying to do any kind of failover. We're generally going to have a facilitator to keep the discussion on track. Especially for an initial tabletop exercise, we want to stay focused. For example, we may limit it to just IT personnel to understand how an incident would be identified, investigated, and forensically preserved. And that might be it. Or we may decide that we want to test with just the executive team to understand how they would communicate within the organization, who would make the notifications to external parties. Even just understanding how often does your executive team want to be kept updated as a situation develops? What's the battle rhythm going to be? Do they want to hear from you as the IT person once an hour? Do they want a daily update? So those are some of the things that we might look at when we're doing a tabletop exercise. Once we've done a successful tabletop, and you can do multiple tabletops with different groups within your organization, the next level would be what we call a functional exercise. So as an example, within our IT division, we may want to run an exercise that requires us to restore systems from backup. Or we could test the executive team by then simulating a critical system, let's say payroll going down for an extended period of time due to a cyber attack. And we would ask them what the business process is and how they would respond to that. Full-scale exercises would be the next level, right? And that's used much less often in the corporate world. We don't see it very often. They're extensive and they're expensive to conduct, but the government and specific military organizations do them a lot. Most often, these are used in organizations whose primary mission would be to respond to a crisis. Other organizations will very often have the opportunity to participate in these, for example, local first responders. But we don't see this type of exercise a lot with companies in the defense industrial base. Obviously, if you have the opportunity to participate, it's a great opportunity, not just for the experience, but for learning and seeing what a full-scale exercise is actually like. So if you have some experience within your organization, you can develop and run your own incident response exercises, particularly tabletops. Start with a basic scenario, design some questions around it, and get everybody around the table talking about it. If not, though, if no one in the organization has experience doing any kind of exercise, it can really be helpful to have an exercise designer and a facilitator, especially if it's your first time.
Well, I hope people watch what you just rattled off, because that was really, really good. I think that one of the biggest things is people, even if they wanted to do a tabletop, they have no idea what it is or how to kind of run it or who should be there or anything like that.
Right.
So that was really, really good what you just went over, and how you could segment into just the IT, just the executive people. So that was really, really good. So
yeah, it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I think the reason that a lot of companies just sort of skip that control is, first of all, it's a 1-point control, right? So if you're not doing it, it's only a point off of your score. But I think people just get overwhelmed looking at it and thinking about what that actually means. And it doesn't have to be as tricky as is implied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that was really, really good. Okay. Our next question. So what are some overall goals of testing the capability, and what about for individual organizations?
Yeah. The overall goal should always be to identify weaknesses in your plans, find some areas for improvement, and to just get comfortable with it. It's much more difficult to do this under pressure. And if you've never done it, if you've never walked through it, even if you have a plan, when you're dealing with a crisis situation, it's like muscle memory, right? We want to have gone through it. We want to remember, hey, this is what we talked about last time, and this person needs this specific information. It makes it so much easier. So, your overall goal is to identify that weakness and get comfortable. Identifying things like, what information did you need during the exercise that you didn't have, right? This happens a lot. When an executive will say, well, how come we're not calling our cyber liability provider? And then nobody around the table knows who to call or what the 800 number is, or if they had to do anything specific before you call in an incident. One thing that's specific to the DibNet is we want to make sure that our certificates are active, because you do need that medium assurance chain certificate when you make the report to the DibNet. And so making sure that is your certificate active? Who's the person that's going to actually log in and make that report? Who's going to handle specific tasks? Another good overall goal is to examine what would happen if the investigation goes beyond the capability of your internal IT staff. Who is going to be your go-to for further investigation, forensics, for containment? Very often IT departments, especially in small to mid-sized businesses, can get overwhelmed really quickly when they're dealing with an incident of any size and scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think within the organization, your testing objectives might vary a little. So those are some of your high level goals. If this is the first time that you're performing an exercise, you're going to do a tabletop with a specific objective. So, I mentioned earlier, maybe you want to understand how you would conduct business if a specific system is down. You could set a goal to identify some communications templates that may need to be created. One of my favorite exercise injects is to take away a company's ability to use Teams or Zoom. And then I ask them, how are you going to communicate if everybody's remote and you don't have Teams? Because let's say, maybe some of your teams have been compromised. So those are some of the things that you may want to look at internally. We just want to get a little more granular and a little more specific.
Well, this is all awesome stuff here. Okay. All right. So we just went over that. So here's another. What kind of evidence is needed to show that a test exercise has been conducted? That's a good point. What do you videotape everybody doing this, or how do you, prove that you did this?
Yeah, well, you could certainly videotape it. That's one way to do it. If you're doing a virtual meeting, either over Zoom or Teams, you could record it. That would be another way to show that you've conducted it. I always provide my clients with at least 2 documents. So one is going to be the exercise scenario. So this is the design. Here's our situation. Here are the questions that we discussed and responded to. And then the second document is going to be an after action report. And the after action report is such an important document, and it's always overlooked. Even when you do an actual incident, when you're responding to an actual incident, you should always go back and say, what did we do well? What do we need to change? What can we do better? And that document, the AAR, is going to list out the improvements that you need to make. It's typically going to assign those tasks to a specific person or a department. And then it provides evidence for an auditor that you actually participated in an exercise. It's going to include everyone who was there, what their role is. It's going to summarize the scenario. It's going to summarize the discussion. And then it's going to have sections that really highlight, these are some of the weaknesses that we identified. These are some of the changes that we plan to make. And so those are really good documents to have to give to an auditor. Even if you record it, I always say you should create an after action report, because otherwise, if you identify all these weaknesses and then you don't assign those tasks to anyone, it's similar. Most of our audience listening is familiar with the plan of action and milestones. If you're not assigning it a deadline and to a specific person, it's probably not going to get done. And then your exercise wasn't necessarily a wasted effort, but when you go to do the next exercise or when you need it for an actual incident, you haven't made those changes that you identified earlier.
Also, why documentation is such an important thing. When we don't write things down and put things exactly in place, like you're saying, and assign them to people, they do tend to just, oops, we forgot about that, kind of thing. So,
yeah.
Well, this was really, really great. So do you have anything else you want to throw in here before we go?
Yeah, just, a couple final thoughts is this doesn't have to be overwhelming. You want to just start somewhere. You can look at common scenarios. There's common scenarios available out there on the internet. And like I said earlier, analysis has shown that this is one of the controls that's most often marked as not implemented. I would argue, though, that this is one of the most critical things that you can do to actually manage and reduce your risk, right? So we talk a lot about not wanting to just check boxes when we're implementing NIST 800-171 and going through the DFARS process. We really want to actually reduce risk. We're going to spend a lot of time and money to put all these things in place. We want our system to be better. And so instead of thinking of this as, checking a box or it's only a 1-point control, I would encourage you to look at it as something that you're probably going to have to deal with at some point. The reality is most companies are going to have to deal with a crisis like this or a data breach at some point. And having walked through it when you're not in crisis mode is so helpful when the time comes.
Absolutely. Like you said, muscle memory, if you don't go through something, then you're not going to remember. But if you have gone through it a few times, you're going to say, oh, that's right. I remember this, remember that. Well, this was absolutely fantastic, Heather. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
You're welcome.
Hopefully you'll come back and do another one on something else.
Absolutely.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for watching, and thank you, Heather, for your time, and we'll see you on the next episode. Until then.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.